Son of David, my daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession. But he didn't respond to her at all. His disciples came and urged him, send her away. She keeps shouting out after us. But Jesus replied, I can send only to the lost sheep, the people of Israel. But she knelt before him and said, Lord, help me. He replied, it's not good to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs. And she said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off their master's table. Jesus answered, woman, you have great faith. It will be just as you wish. And right then, her daughter was healed. Friends, these words are from our Holy Scriptures given to us that we might find the light and the love of God. And our response is, thanks be to God. This is the kind of narrative that if you're around here all the time, and it's so exciting to see so many people back from summer vacations and all kinds of things. We have a lot of teachers and kids in our congregation. So to begin into the fall, we've got so many fun things happening. It's good to see everybody here. But this is the kind of story that we love to jump on at a place like your life, right? Here you have this seemingly ostracized woman, right? She's female. She's Canaanite, not Jewish. She's got a sick child, and she comes to Jesus asking for help, and Jesus seems to be the problem here. Just to rehearse it with you so you've got it in your heads, because I'm going to play with it here in a moment. He first declares that he's sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. That's after first saying nothing, but then he says it's only to the lost sheep of Israel. And then when she continues to beg, Jesus says, it's not good to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Without missing a beat, her quick-witted heroine response is, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And only then does Jesus heal her because of her great faith. Sure, in our community, on one hand, we like a story like this because here's this woman we can point to, and Jesus listens to her, and she's on the margins. And at the end, when we have discussion, I hope a lot of people jump in and say ways that you've heard this story or maybe found this story empowering. But today, I want to double down on this, but Jesus seems to be the problem here. In part because I've been told as a theologian, and I tell other people this, that the good news in the Gospels is about Jesus. And I want to know how, if this is good news, because Jesus here seems to be the problem. Let me rehearse it again for you. It's Jesus who throws around elitist claims about Israel versus other people. It's Jesus who is the one who's comparing the Canaanites, and by implication then, this woman and her daughter to dogs, right? He's like, it's not to, let the dogs eat what belongs to the children. It's Jesus who seems unwilling to heal this mother's sick child. And it's even problematic when people try to get Jesus off the hook in a passage like this. And I'm a biblical scholar, that's my training. So definitely I have those inclinations as well. Later on, maybe I'll do some confession and say ways in which I've tried to get Jesus off the hook in here. But it was disheartening to me to go look at what so many of my colleagues have written in commentaries. And one of the first things that they say is like, well, dogs isn't really a racial slur. And I'm like, okay, it may not technically be so, but it's still not nice, right? If anyone were to call me or my people or my family that, I'm not going to be thrilled, right? Another thing that people say, especially in my field, is like, well, Jesus is just testing the people. He's either testing this woman and seeing if she really has faith and if she believes. But that suggests that God's love and compassion and healing is only available if, we do enough, right? That's a problem. I know plenty of people who've been told in the midst of sickness, you didn't believe enough. What a crappy message. That can't be it. Or I also have heard these kinds of things of well, Jesus was just saying what the other people around him thought. He's pronouncing it out loud so that they can learn their lesson. Again, I struggle with that as an option of the three options I presented so far. That's probably the best one. But it does feel like if that's the case, Jesus is kind of toying with people or them in ways that it doesn't seem like he does in a lot of other texts. In fact, I'm left with this question, and I hope you're with me on this. Is this how our God walks among us? Is this how our God acts? Does our God claim to be for a few and not for all? Does our God call Canaanites dogs? Is our God compassionate, or not compassionate, but uncompassionate about the suffering of a child in this story? How is this God among us? Emmanuel, which is what Matthew tells us Jesus is. Here's where I'm going to make a big jump, because if you're part of this community, you probably have already thought about that related to this passage. And if you're coming to this passage for the first time, welcome. This is the kinds of hard discussions we have on a regular basis. We want to just jump straight in and talk about some really tough texts. But at the same time that this is maybe one that's familiar to us and we felt the weight of this, I'm going to push really hard today, and that's why we have discussion at the end. That's one of the things I like about this community, is that my pushing on something doesn't mean that it's the final or the right or the only answer to a tough text like this. Instead, it's to make us think and think together. So, and like I said, I'm a teacher, so I don't care if you yell back at me at the end or if you disagree with me. Hey, that's fine. I'm good with stuff like that. Here's the two things I'm going to say, and they're both related to a general theme, which is, what if this narrative, what if this story about Jesus isn't an anomaly, isn't something that we can just throw away, but it is Matthew actually trying to show us what it means for God to be, two words, with us. Okay, let me start with the with. When it comes to, and I'm thinking these ones out loud too. I wrote stuff down, but rather than me just reading it, I'm going to kind of talk through it, and that's why it's going to give you a chance after I talk through it for you to talk about it. But what if we took seriously that in the incarnation, God has become truly human and is with us in every possible way? Now, most of the time, we have this tendency to say, well, yeah, but God can't be with us like that. And this is a text in which that bumps up against our kind of modern sensibilities. How could God be with us and say these kinds of things that seem to be racially or ethnically distinguishing or problematic? Let me say why I think it's important for it to be the case that God is with us even in those things. Because Christian history has had this kind of tendency to say, well, there's certain things that we can't say about God. And yet every one of those instances is times when other theologians or Christians have pushed back and said, no, if you draw a line there, then redemption isn't possible in that area of life. I'm getting back to my story, but let me give you two other examples that will get you into this and understand why I'm thinking about this or how I'm thinking about it. One is the example that pretty early on in Christianity, there was a lot of anxiety about the idea that Jesus could be God and go to the cross. How could our God suffer? How could God die? Those seem like things that are impossible for God. And yet, early on, the Docetists are kind of arguing, oh, it just seems like Jesus suffers. It just seems like he dies. Other theologians came along and said, no, if he doesn't actually suffer, if his body isn't there in the midst of that, right, then our suffering can't be redeemed either. You have to have a God who suffers. And it doesn't clear up all the problems to insist on that. It opens a bunch of doors, but only is redemption possible if our God is a God who suffers, and then our suffering isn't lost. Instead, it's taken up into the very life of God. Let me give you a second example of a time in which we've said, well, God can't do this. God can't be here. This guy, his name is Nestorius. He's kind of the end of a line of people that is worried about Jesus' humanity. And if Jesus is really God, how can Jesus have certain experiences? And Nestorius is like, well, the most important one for us to worry about is Jesus being born, because a baby passes through a vagina. And How can Jesus do that? That seems unbefitting of God, right? How can God be birthed in that kind of way? The problem is the women, right? Which that seems to be the case again and again. And yet Cyril of Alexandria argues back as hard as he can. And he says, no, if you draw the line there, then that can't be redeemed. Our brokenness as men and women, our brokenness as people, the way that we have put certain groups of people, certain genders down, can't be redeemed. No, this has to be something. And it doesn't, again, clear up all the problems or make the case easy. But it's this insistence that only where our God goes is redemption fully possible. In this story, which has something to do with race and ethnicity, and I keep saying both of those words because in my field, again, one of the ways to slap people around a little bit is to say, well, racism is a modern invention. And I agree. There is something about nation state and the ways that post the Industrial Revolution we have a certain view of racism. But there is a distinction between these Canaanites and Jews in this story that we still have to struggle with here. If we say, our God can't go there, our God can't be involved in the discussion of what it means to other people, then no wonder we still struggle in Christian churches dealing with problems related to racism and ethnic difference. Because if our God can't go there, how can that be redeemed? That's our question. What are we willing to say our God is in the process of redeeming? Here's my second one, is if God has to be with us, and with us is a lot bigger than we are usually used to saying, but God is with us in our suffering, God is with us in our brokennesses, in our relational brokennesses. What does it mean to say that God is us? I think part of the reason that this story bumps up against most of our sensibilities, including my sensibilities, so strongly, is because I want Jesus to be an individual who somehow isn't affected by his community that raised him or the community he participates in. But that's to not take seriously that none of us are just me, right? I'm me because of all the people and voices who have been a part of shaping me and making me. And so when the disciples say to him, just send her away, it's not out of nothing that he comes to this encounter with this woman. He comes to it out of years of experiences with his people. And it's so much better, I think, for us if we were like, oh, well, Jesus is unique from the rest of his people, right? He can just stand apart. But if Jesus isn't us, if there isn't kind of a recognition that our identities are always communally formed, then again, this question about redemption is really big. As I think about the us, though, I would play with it two different ways here. I want to say, on the one hand, his us is formed just like the us is formed sometimes in ways that are so much bigger than I see or realize all the time. Let me see if I can give you an example that would make this concrete in some ways. I don't want to think of myself as participating in racist systems. In fact, I actually, quite intentionally, on one-to-one relationships, in all kinds of ways, try to fight against that. But it's kind of so deeply embedded in my community sphere that even when I am trying, I still live in a certain neighborhood here in Nampa and not in another neighborhood. When I go to the store, I don't have to worry if the clerk in the store is going to suspect that I'm stealing. When I get stopped by a police officer, as it was this week, I don't have to fear my interaction with them. When I go to the hospital or to the doctor, I don't have to try to convince them that my pain is real. These are things that I'm embedded in, and they're not my fault alone, but I'm embedded in a community that has these experiences that are real, whether or not I want to admit them as us. There's no way that I am I without how I've experienced life in relation to everybody else. Here's the second one. And then I've got two ideas for us to move forward. The second one is that the us changes radically as Jesus encounters this woman. It's so easy for me to live in an us that is just my people. I go to church here, I go to a certain grocery store, I go to a certain library even, right? And I see the same people over and over again. But all of a sudden, Jesus' us is transformed, and the disciples' us is transformed by their encounter with this woman. If we're really going to say God is God with us, Emmanuel, I would say this story isn't an anomaly. It's actually Matthew teaching us to say God goes to the depth of our muckiness. God goes all the way into experience what it means to be us, and us that's formed with all kinds of prejudices and assumptions. And those prejudices and assumptions are transformed, redeemed, changed. I realize as you're looking at me, you're like, whew, I don't know if I came in for all this today. Fine, I get it. Let me at least give you two options for us to discuss as we discuss forward, and then I'm also going to open up the discussion to some stories, which is sometimes how we best encounter an event like this. Something that pushes on our own assumptions and our own kind of ideas about what needs to be up. The two kind of responses I give, because I still got to this end of this point, and I was like, okay, maybe Matthew is not telling a one-off story that I can just dismiss. Maybe Matthew is actually pushing my understanding of what it means for Jesus to be God with us. I'm in. But what is still the good news? Because I promised you at the very beginning, Jesus is the good news. And again, I'm not going to give you one option, I'm going to give you two today. Like, two seems to be my theme for the day. Because both of them are classic kind of answers that have been given in the church. But then maybe we should apply to thinking about what does it mean to be in communities of difference? And how are we transformed in the midst of our experiences to be Christ-like? Here's the two options. One is kind of a probably more classic option that you've heard before, and I think it's a better option than a lot of other things. So I'm not in any way saying this one's negative. I'll tell you some of the good things about it. I'll tell you some of the things that worry me about it. It's classically called the moral influence theory, and it's that an encounter like this that Jesus has with this woman gives us an example for how we should go out and act or interact with people too. Here's some of the things that we could think about in this story between Jesus if we were to go and do likewise. Jesus, not maybe right away, but he eventually enters into dialogue with somebody who's different from him and perhaps more marginalized. I'll come back to why I'm saying perhaps in our case. But Jesus has this conversation with somebody who he doesn't normally have conversations with, somebody who's outside of his circle. And he gives us this example, right? For us too, to go out and to expand our circles, to have conversations with people who might challenge our way of thinking, who might give us a new view on things. Jesus, again, I'm going to say eventually, heals the daughter in this story, right? He doesn't just leave the situation as this, like, thanks for letting me know, good for you. Instead, the daughter is healed, that community is addressed, their needs are met, the woman and her daughter are taken care of. So there's some implication to it. I think implied in this too, when people use this interpretation, there's a couple of things that aren't explicit in Matthew's text, but would be helpful for us too. Which is that Jesus seems to confess his prior assumptions, whereas he said, I've come for Israel, now he all of a sudden heals the woman. That seems to be a turning around, a changing of ways entirely. And it's implied that he's willing to learn from someone else who is not him, and not of his community, and not of his status. He's willing to learn from the other. Again, maybe we would say a less powerful other, a more marginalized other. If so, and if we want to take this route, it's actually a decent route, because it gives us some steps to walk forward out of here with and to do immediately. It says to me, hey, I'm supposed to have conversations with people that I don't normally have conversations with and learn from them. It says to me, hey, I sometimes need to confess that I have grown up with assumptions or experiences that are problematic and that shape my worldview in ways that I need to confess them. It says to me, not only do I need to confess them personally, but I need to do something in those communities to make things right, to lift them up. Overall, I think there's some good stuff here. And if you're like, okay, she's talked enough about race today, I'm going to tap out at this point. If you want to take that and run with it, blessings to you. Yes, awesome. Do that. If all of us did those things alone, like confess the ways in which we have prejudices, if we encountered others, if we made sure that our encounters with them led to their life and wholeness. Hey, if you're willing to go with me just a little farther though, I will say some of my worries about this, which is probably our typical response around here too, is to kind of read this story this way. Here's some of my worries about it, is that, again, I'm trying to think about Jesus in this text. We end up moving Jesus around to make him who we want him to be. So on some days he's Jewish and he's oppressed by the Roman Empire. And on some days he is the person in power, and we kind of make ourselves into Jesus in the story every time. Sometimes we're the people being oppressed by things that we don't like in our governments and our societies. And then sometimes we are the people who need to listen to somebody else. Like, it's a very, it doesn't both attend to the historical complicatedness of the situation in which Jesus was both in an oppressed situation and maybe has some advantage over this woman. But it also then causes us to end up with a story in which oftentimes it's still told from a predominantly white, middle class perspective, in which I need to listen to somebody who is non-white or female. It's got a kind of a temptation to tokenize it, I think, is what I should say. Let me give you a second option. And again, I'm reiterating this several times because today's discussion is going to be really important. Because I'm not saying that the first one is wrong by saying I've got some worries about it. I'm not saying this one is right. I'm just giving a different option so that we can have some space to discuss it. This is also a classical kind of atonement, these are atonement theories that we have in theology. And it's closer to kind of Wesleyanism, but it also is a bit more murky, a kind of participation theology. Paul says this when he says, I am in Christ, but also Christ is in you. Like, he's thinking about the ways in which participation works. If we read this story as a participatory story, what does it make us think about what it means to be human or to receive our identity from another? Here's some ideas that I have. One is it acknowledges that Jesus was shaped by the community that raised him. And there's something about acknowledging those things and not just the bad part of it, but all of it, and saying I can't somehow get away from that. It's not like I can ever separate myself entirely and pretend like I wasn't part of that raising. It's also taking responsibility for it. It's interesting, we teach over, when I was over at NNU, we used to teach that there's two ways to think about confession, and this story has always been taught as a story about confession. Could be I've wronged something. The confession is also taking responsibility. And so in this story, maybe part of the participation is, part of me being me is I grew up in this. But yet that identity is reshaped for Jesus when he encounters this woman, because all of a sudden his community is no longer this that was the past, but his community now includes the woman as well. And so he and the disciples have to, they have to respond differently, because how Jesus responds to the needs of this woman, and especially her sick child, defines his humanity from here on forward. What does it mean for us to be people who say, yeah, this is how I grew up, but if I'm not actively engaging in stories that make someone else's life whole and better, then my humanity is not as deep as it could be. I'm not being the faithful person that I could be. Again, there are implied notions to this reading too, just like there were to the other one. This identity that I'm talking about only takes shape when we care about the outcome of what it means for the other person. And so it's not just enough to say, hey, I want to not be racist, which is how we often approach a story like this. I don't want Jesus to be racist, I don't want to be racist. But it's beyond that. It's just saying, well, what kinds of ways do I participate in society, do I participate in us, that's actually transforming the very communal interactions that we have that become life-giving for an entire different community than my own, right? Are my interactions life-giving for them? And then also, I think not just Jesus is transformed by this story, and not just the woman and her daughter are healed, but there's some kind of healing for the community that Jesus came from, because they see somebody who's still one of them saying, oh, but our being us doesn't mean that we can violate that person over there. Our being us means we have to care for those people over there because we aren't caring for them. Are we faithful as well? I realize it's a little more worky, and it's got its weaknesses too. It's beyond the text a little bit more. It's pushing us to think not just that this story is the end of the story, but what does this mean, like, in a larger range. It might also be a little bit harder to grasp because we're people who tend to like concrete answers. And what a part of the story to read it that way is participatory, is to say, every person I meet continues to reframe the way that I understand myself and my community. It's not just like once and done. Oh, now I'm check the box, no longer prejudiced in any kind of way. Instead, I constantly have to live into this, which is a bit exhausting. I mean, the invitation to that is a bit exhausting in our day. But I think either of these, and this is where I'll bring it in for just a moment and then invite you to reflect too. Either of these comes at, in a slightly different way, what we've been talking about in this whole series, which is we keep using this short-term unhandedness. And so as we've been telling these stories about Jesus, we say Jesus asks us to be unhanded, which we like. It's a kind of cool word, but it's also been kind of a slippery word for us. And so let's think about some of what we mean when we say we've been unhanded this summer. On the one hand, unhanded means letting go of some of the assumptions that I have, and there are a whole bunch of assumptions in this story, right? There's assumptions that one group of people has against another, there's assumptions we have about what Jesus or God can be or not be, and unhandedness means like, okay, I'm willing to look at this story again from a totally different angle, and what does that teach me? There's an unhandedness in receiving identity, because it means I don't get to decide who I am as much as I want to, and as much as I can participate in that, as long as I'm connected to other people, and I have to be connected to other people to be human, right? Then I have to recognize that those other people influence me in good ways and bad ways. And as I encounter more and more people, I have to change my ways of thinking and change my experiences. And yet, another way of thinking about unhandedness is like, this is what it means to be Christ-like. Because Christ-likeness is constant transformation. It's not just once, but again and again, that me and my community encounter somebody who bumps up against the way that we had thought thus far, and they're no longer them and us. We're now people who are in relationship, and the outcome for their life, and the outcome for my life, and the outcome for the community that I belong to are all now bound up together. That's kind of unhandedness as well. Today, we're going to move to some discussion. I want to invite, or just say to those who have joined us online, like friends online, oh, I should read the questions first, right? I'm going to read the questions for you so that hopefully you can find someone to discuss them with. But then we're going to continue to discuss this in here today. I do think this is one, but I'm trying to invite you to discussion. And like I said, not one way forward, but hopefully have provided several kind of options for how to talk about it. Here's the questions we're going to talk about. One, what are some identities that you have received from communities you have either participated in previously or that you participate in now? Can we begin to identify some of the things that we would say, hey, this marks us? And they can be good or bad. Like, that's part of why it's so complicated. Two, how do we see Jesus being the recipient of identity in this narrative? I'm saying that Jesus is modeling the unhandedness in this case. Do you agree with me? How do you see that? If you don't see that, feel free to push back. And then three, what are some opportunities in real life for receiving identity interpersonally from someone or someones who might transform our assumptions about human experience in 2026? I realize that one's a little bit wordy, but basically I'm asking us, like, as we move forward into this year, if we're not just going to be an enclave, What are our opportunities for engaging, and how does that engagement then change us, transform us as a community? Now, if you've been joining us online, friends online, we're so thankful that you've joined us this morning. May God bless you and keep you. May your understanding of who God is deepen, and may you embody God's goodness.